Hi, this is Paul. Somebody tipped me off to this news channel. It's very small at this point, but it's a podcast. Apparently, probably the podcast is a little larger than the channel. On YouTube, it's simply called The Sacred. And these people are very much barking up the same tree that we are. They are bringing on some of the same people that we have. They have an organization behind it. And this woman, oh shoot, what's her name? Elizabeth Oldfield is taking my shtick. She's getting people's stories. Now, I am not jealous because certainly getting people's stories is not new to me. This is the long old craft of pastors, because if we are curators of people's, healers of people's souls, then we are so hopefully faithful, good stewards and curators of their stories, because your soul and your story are not that far apart. And John has obviously been on a journey. You can go back to my first conversation with John, where he is quite tentative. And you'll notice that bit by bit by bit, as he, I don't know why, I think as he gets a sense that his mission to the world with respect to the meaning crisis is, of course, deeply tied to his own personal story, as is always the truth. That's what calling and vocation is. And so John has been increasingly open about his past, and he was quite open in this video. And this is, I noted on Twitter, this is one of my new favorite videos, interviews with John. It's just a remarkable interview. And I've been getting into the one that she's done with Ian McGilchrist, which is also a remarkable interview. And so I was thinking about this morning, and thinking about fundamentalism, especially with respect to all the stuff I've done on Ayaan Hirsi Ali and her new conversion. And now if you're interested in her story, you simply must check out the interview that she does on Unheard with Freddie Sayers in the Unheard Club. I don't really know what that is, but and when I say, like I did in that little video that I just released right now, her conversion is authentic, I mean that very much in the sense of authenticity. She is not being disingenuous. She's not playing a political game. She's not doing any of this. But in many ways, you can't understand her story without the story of Islamic fundamentalism and the Muslim Brotherhood that radicalized her. And then, to her horror, Jordan Peterson always says, it's not what soldiers witness that give them PTSD. It's what they do themselves. Because it's one thing to know that there's evil out in the world. It's another thing to know that evil is possible by my own hand. That is the truly traumatic, because suddenly your personhood and your identity are in crisis. But fundamentalism is, I wouldn't say it's unique to the modern period, but what happened in terms of the Christian church and what we call fundamentalism in Western Christianity has everything to do with trauma and, I think, domicide. I think there's a deep connection between domicide and fundamentalism. And actually, I thought about this morning. I thought, I should shoot John an email. But then I thought, well, then I'm going to be typing about all of my thoughts. And maybe it would just be easier if I made a video. And then maybe John and I will have a conversation at some point about this relationship between domicide and fundamentalism. Because I think John is really onto something with this domicide idea. He sort of began rolling that out at the Chino conference, and if you hear in a number of his videos, he's continued to develop it. And for Ayaan Hirsi Ali, it's interesting. I know she probably sort of upset some people when she talked about, not 6-day creation, not all of these fights, because those were the fundamentalist fights. And those fights were all about domicide for people, because what happened in the 19th century with the rise of Darwinian evolution and the dislocation of the Bible from what Jonathan Peugeot calls universal history, fundamentalists sort of doubled down in a way that had never quite been the way before. There's a difference between sort of a naive supposition about an implicit universal history and then a demanding double down and a rigidity now with modernistic categories, questions, and assumptions. And again, C.S. Lewis works on a bunch of this in Miracles because in many ways there are these inflection points in history that once you cross them, and Owen Barfield's work is sort of, brings this to light. Once a question emerges, you can't sort of unask the question. And if in fact you can't see past the question, that question is going to become a stumbling block. And in many ways, those kinds of questions created the modernist fundamentalist fights that sort of that shredded the churches and continue to shred the church by posing questions that aren't, and again, it's tremendously difficult to talk about. And you've seen Jonathan Peugeot wrestle with some of these things because when he speaks symbolically, people think that he's speaking metaphorically in the sense that Brett Weinstein talks about metaphorical truth, which is a degraded truth from what he uses that horrible word literal. And I would say get rid of that word literal because it doesn't mean what you think you mean. Let's say physical truth. And again, even once in this polarized realm of modernism versus fundamentalism, even once you start posing those questions, people will say, well, what about the physical resurrection? And I've spoken about the physical resurrection plenty. I've spoken about miracles plenty. Those aren't questions for me. But the way that fundamentalism sort of happens, and I think part of the difference, let's say, between fundamentalist Christianity, at least many versions of it, and fundamentalist Islam, is again, right at the center of Christianity, you have a man dying on the cross pleading forgiveness for his enemies. And I think that's part of what has made Christianity less violent, Christian fundamentalists less violent than, let's say, fundamentalists from other religious traditions or other legacy religions, as John would call them. Well, let's play a little bit of this, and then maybe I'll finish that up.
Okay. I am going to let that percolate for a minute, and I want to pause and give the listener a sense of who's talking. They may have joined us and gone, what is happening? Went deep.
No doubt.
Very fast. And I want to give them a sense of who you are and the journey that has led you to be so fascinated with those ideas. So please can you tell me a little bit about your childhood, kind of 10 and under? What were the big ideas in the air that formed you?
So, I was brought up in a not just a nuclear family, an extended family of very strict fundamentalist Christianity. But with a high need for cognition, as a psychologist would say, in which I was deeply interested in the scientific understanding of the world. At age 10.
Now, that interest in the scientific understanding of the world isn't just a function of him as an individual, let's say, as his personality. It's also a function of fundamentalisms generally. Because what happened in Christian fundamentalism was that when doubts were cast on the previously assumed universal history, that got increasingly and unknowingly scientistic as sort of scientistic ways of thinking, and scientism sort of rose in the culture. That impacted people at a deep level, and so they started having questions, and then started, once they had these questions, finding answers, which led to a whole bunch of really strange things, like how many Jerichos and how many blind men, and what specifically, who specifically are in these genealogies. And it's not that these questions never occurred before, because you could find those kinds of questions littered throughout church fathers and Hebrew scholars, and everybody had sort of worked on these things. But in the modern scientific period, I call it basically the scientific lab leak, begins to infect and impact all these different ways of thinking at a very deep level. It's not unlike when I did my talk with Brett Sockold about his book on transubstantiation, how the complex and subtle and often unseen changes in philosophy below the surface suddenly gave Luther a crisis that perhaps was caused by the fact that the categories with which he read Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle had changed by the time they got to Luther, but Luther was not aware of the changes. And you see this kind of thing all the time, because we're always reading these words, and these words are always moving. They're living things. And an example that I use often is in the King James Bible. There's this verse, "In my Father's house there are many mansions." And this, in the modern period, leads Christians to sort of imagine buildings like you would see with a Monopoly guy. You know, in my Father's house there are many mansions, when in fact the Old English word is much more like manse, which is basically like a stopping place overnight. That English language word shifted. And in many more subtle ways, the language continues to shift. And so part of what happens with Christian fundamentalism is that you have the rise of, let's say, creation science, which I'm not saying creation science is an illegitimate thing to pursue to try to figure things out. And in fact, I think it's good to have them because they actually sort of break things open and have people ask fresh questions, even if their scientific method, well, I'm not going to talk about that. But the way of thinking gets impacted. And so in many ways, the modernists and the fundamentalists have more in common with each other than they necessarily do with Christian thinkers who were thinking in very different categories 500, 1,000, or 1,500 years before.
And it would have been my fascination with dinosaurs and with the prehistoric world.
Okay, why dinosaurs? It runs through the Tom Holland story too. It's a very common story. And then, of course, then you get these Bible books where you have Adam and Eve. And why aren't the dinosaurs here anymore? Well, they drowned. Well, what about the pterodactyls? And,
As the one for quite a few young males. So there was, although I didn't realize it at first, there was a deep tension in my upbringing. Because for all of the ways in which I might be critical of my mother for imposing the fundamentalist Christianity that in many ways caused some of the most traumatic experiences of my life for me as a young person. I also want to credit her for she never tried to crush my scientific interest, and she realized that I had a burning desire to know, and
I mean, this just brings tears to my eyes. This tenderness, this truth, this authenticity, where, and this is so often what happens with our stories with our parents. Now, I was blessed to never really have a divorce from my parents' faith or my parental relationships or any of that. But I mean, this is just so powerful.
She's dead now, and I've been through therapy to wrestle with things. And I've come to realize how she was wrestling with a lot of things in her life that drove her into fundamentalism, and also how I must have been, I'll get personal here. I only found out when I was in my 30s that, and I mean this in the literal sense of the word, I'm a bastard. My mom and dad were married to other people and had an affair, and I was the result of it. And my mom was a very young woman. And because of that, the family, because of its fundamentalist Christianity, sort of black sheeped her, if that's a verb. And though she now, when people are put in those kinds of situations,
they black sheeped her. That's domicide. They put her out of the herd. They dislocated her. And that's what's so powerful about this understanding and seeing domicide, that of course it's not just about being put out of a physical home or a physical land or a physical country, because you can make two errors. One would be to imagine that the land or the home or the physical surroundings are unimportant. No, they are. But the other would be to imagine that the social community, especially something as intimate as a religious community or a family, is unimportant. No, they're absolutely foundational. And so when you look at the rise of fundamentalisms around the world, in this age of incredible social migration and dislocation, there are now more refugees probably than at any other point in human history. And those refugees might be refugees because of war, refugees because of natural disaster, and maybe refugees because of economics. The amount of domicide going through the human race right now is enormous, which would, I would imagine, lead to people embracing various forms of fundamentalism as a reaction and a response. Because if there's anything fundamentalism is about, it's about a religious attempt, let's say an upper story attempt to achieve a level of certainty, to relocate one's place in the world. The difficulty is that the fundamentalisms often create a certain rigidity. And while the domicide itself may have created a lot of trauma, rigidity creates, let's say, micro traumas and other reactions of trauma. So in a sense, the domicide that his mother experienced in some ways sets up the domicide that John would experience because of the rigidity. And in some ways, the incompetence. I mean, again, I don't want to judge the pastor of the story that John's about to tell, but I just wish that conversation had gone very differently.
They have two possible responses. One is to completely reject that religious framework, or the other is to completely assimilate and say, you're absolutely right, I'm a sinner, and she went the second route. And so you can imagine how her attitude to me must have been very challenged. Here's the mark of the destructive sin that ripped her life apart. But yet, and sorry, I don't like to do this because it sounds like I'm praising myself, but here's an extraordinary.
You're not praising yourself, John. You're giving yourself for the people who have entrusted their souls in your care by sharing your story. This is one thing therapists usually can't do. Pastors can do it, and John as a teacher is doing it.
Ordinary kid. I don't like to do this because it sounds like I'm praising myself, but here's an extraordinary kid. He's going to go on to university. Nobody in the extended family does. One other cousin, right? And so it's like she called me and she named me John, which means a gift from God. And so she's like, there was this deep ambivalence in her, and I've come to try to understand that because it was very much she wanted to somehow purify me, and so I was subject to a very rigid purity code. But she also didn't want to strangle the giftedness, because the giftedness was, in some sense, I think, I'm supposing here, redemptive for her. It was like, well, this can't have been a complete and utter mistake, or God would not have given me this child. Again, I apologize for talking in this self-referential manner. And so I've come to realize, and to some degree, I internalized that, because what happened is I was traumatized by that religion. Some of the most traumatic experiences in my life. I'll relate two. So I was brought up in a form of Christianity that believes in the rapture, and around 10 years of age, I came home, and this had not happened to me before. I came over to school. It was back in the days when you could walk home from school by yourself and nobody was afraid, right? And there was nobody home. And I was absolutely convinced that the rapture had occurred. I was clearly a sinner, had been left behind, and the Antichrist and his minions were coming. I cannot explain to you, I cannot convey to you, and remember, this is a 10-year-old, the terror And that is the only noun that covers it, the terror that I was in. That's a traumatizing experience, and it takes a lot of time and reflection, therapeutic endeavor to get out of how that. The other one is, I read in the Bible, and it's a couple places, Jesus says it at one point in the Gospels, and Paul says it, and there's the unforgivable sin. And what's really maddening about those verses is they don't say what it is.
Yeah.
Right? So you have this blank slate upon which you project all of your anxieties as to what it. And so I, like, around the same time, I think a little bit over, like 12, I'm like, have I done it? Have I committed the unforgivable? What is it? Is thinking that and you get into this spiral, and it was horrible, horrible, horrible. And my mom, she could see that I was just terribly distraught. I give her credit for this too. But she did what the only thing she could think to do. She took me to the pastor of my church, and I posed this problem to me, and he gave me the most vapid, unsatisfying, platitudinous answers that even a 12-year-old recognized had no significant response or responsibility to the question I gave him or the state I was in. That's also deeply that's traumatized by a profound sense of abandonment to sort of guilt at the level that Luther experienced or something.
Again, domicide, that abandonment. You're moved out of your home. And I think the relationship between domicide, trauma, and fundamentalisms of various kinds, I think that's a lot of what's going on.
Thing like that. And so because of that, I was driven. I read a bunch of books when
and this is fundamentalism. I mean, if you're going to put it was so fun hanging out with Rafe Kelly, because Rafe is super sensitive to these things. And when he would ask me a question and I would be struggling to try to convey an answer verbally, and I would do things with my body, he'd basically make a comment and say, look at what you're doing. It's body first and words second. And, it was a compliment because he said, well, you're clearly an embodied person, because that's sort of the way we work, the process by which we work. But you can see that in what John did right there.
15, 16, I read Lord of Light by Roger Zelazny that introduces me to Buddhism and Hinduism. I read Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha. I read Robertson Davies' Fifth Business that introduces me to Jung, and I'm suddenly opened up. I'm opened up to possibilities that are not disclosed to me in this framework. And and I want to I'm going to hyphenate this word to really bring it out. It encouraged me to break from that framework. But
And in fact, courage is what you need when you are abandoned, cast out, when you are suffering domicide. You need courage, because if you've always slept, I mean, even my little dog loves to sleep in a kennel that's all covered up, likes to sleep in dens. When we used to do homeless shelters here at the church, the bus would come from the city with 100 homeless people, and they were a rush to get off the bus first. And the first thing that they did was we had all the chairs moved out so the floor space was maximum so people could sleep in different areas. And we had another room for women who would be separate, et cetera, another room for families. The first thing, and the men were in the big room usually because there are more of them than any of the other categories. The first thing that they would do was look for nooks. And some of them would take the chairs out and make these little rows of chairs that they could fit in. If you're out exposed, it's courage that you need.
And go very deeply into the scientific part of me. But you're like, we have a mother tongue, we have a mother religion. That religion, for all of its toxic effects, and also because my mom, to give her credit, encouraged me to think and to learn and grow, it left me with a hunger for the transcendent. And so I have spent, I can go more on my personal life, but you just wanted my childhood. That set in me that only sort of that had to be gradually explicated, articulated, elucidated. This quest, which is how I define my life, of bridging between science and spirituality.
Yeah. I want to ask something, but I'm going to tread very carefully because the language is all very slippery, which is about...
Well, by all means, watch the whole thing, because this conversation was absolutely tremendous, the whole thing. And the Ian McGilchrist one is tremendous. And I guess she did one with Jonathan Pajot. I'll have to go look that one up too. I have to, why did everybody wait so long to tell me about this channel? So maybe Elizabeth, maybe she needs to come here and I'll get into her story, because that's what we do. But yeah, this relationship, I remember coming to my father with the same question about the unforgivable sin, because it's just natural when you're a kid and you're reading the Bible for yourself and you read this, and it's like, oh my goodness, maybe I did it by mistake. And then of course in Christian school, even kids would talk about it. And my father basically gave me two answers, gave me a short answer and then a longer answer. And the short answer was, and it's not unique to him, I've heard other people say it too. He says, well, it's probably the kind of thing that if you're worried about it, you don't have to worry about it. Because, and then he gave me a longer answer about it's blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. What is blasphemy against the Holy Spirit? We hear blasphemy and think about blasphemy laws and all of this, but especially within the context of Protestant theology, if you resist and dismiss and denigrate the works of the Holy Spirit in and around you for your entire life, well, that's pretty much equal to damnation. It's not something that you're going to do like, oh, I tripped on the wrinkle in the carpet. So, and of course, my pastor was my father, and I couldn't have had a better pastor. And so, again, I mean, I was blessed. And I think the various fundamentalisms and how they've sort of rippled through the world. Of course, you can read Philip Yancey about this as well. Philip Yancey does a lot of, I started on his biography, and I should probably finish it. I have so many books to finish. But so much trauma out there, and I think fundamentalism, I mean, one of the things about trauma is that trauma tends to forge intergenerational chains. And so, I think that chain had to be broken for John in that encouragement, and so the story continues. But I just want to do a little video. Just notice that connection between Domicide and fundamentalism, and I think it's something worth continuing to ponder. So, just a little video, one little thought. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think.